Is this even possible? A tail gunner falling 20,000 feet and surviving in the severed tail of a mangled flying fortress. Let's dig into the records and find out. And if that sounds bizarre, wait until you see what else I've discovered. You simply won't believe it. In World War II, between all of the newsreels and propaganda from all sides, there was a great deal of stretching of the truth and bias in the news about the war. This is still a problem that exists today. But with ground news, you can finally get news in a different way, with a clear look at how bias is actually represented. Ground News is an app and website that shows all of the top news from around the world and how bias comes into play with each headline and the precise factuality of their sources. For example, you can take a look at the Chinese balloon that was recently shot down over the Atlantic and compare different headlines to see how exactly each outlet may be trying to frame the news. So, if like me, you are sick of bias in the media and want to get a clear picture of how news is being presented, go to ground.news/TJ3 today and sign up for free or subscribe for unlimited access. Thanks again to Ground News for supporting TJ3 History, and now enjoy. The year is 1943. The American bombing campaign against Germany is now the top priority of the 8th Air Force. In an effort to cripple Hitler's war machine, bombing raids are taking place nearly every day against strategic targets all throughout Western Europe. Of the many aircraft taking part in these raids, the star quickly rising to the front of newsreels is the B-17 Flying Fortress. And although she cannot carry quite the load of the B-24, she is still a favorite of American air crews for one clear reason: her ability to take a beating and still get crews back home. But despite her ability to take damage, the B-17 would inevitably see losses in combat, especially here in 1943. During this time, fighter escort was not yet established as the irrefutable strategy over Europe. And still, when fighters were present during these raids, the P-51 Mustang had not yet entered frontline service, so the Thunderbolts had to turn back well before they were over their targets. This left the American fortresses wide open to German fighters. And again, during this early period of the war, German pilots were still highly skilled, since the war of attrition had not yet come for their training, fuel, and airfields. In addition, flak was a deadly adversary on nearly all of these missions, and oftentimes was just as deadly as the Luftwaffe fighters. But nonetheless, despite these risks, brave Americans from across the country took off every day to rain down punishment onto German factories, cities, and targets of military value. One of these many courageous Americans would be a man by the name of Eugene Moran. After passing gunnery school, Eugene was assigned to the 96th Bomb Group in late 1943. The position that he found himself assigned to was the risky but vital tail gunner.
Now, one of the interesting things about the tail gunner is that it was a position that not only had a great deal of responsibility, but it also carried a great deal of risk. The tail gunner was all alone. Not only was he all alone, but he was much farther away from any of the other crew members than any other position on a plane, which meant a lot of times that information could get to him last. If there was significant damage to the plane, if an engine was on fire, or if the pilot or co-pilot were hit, a lot of times the tail gunner would be the last person to know about it, because the only way he's being alerted to this issue is either through an alarm or if somebody comes back there and tells him, because not only is he far away from this, but he's also facing the opposite direction. And so because of these factors, a lot of times the tail gunners were some of the last people that found out that it was time to get out of the plane. And when combined with the already difficult task of exiting the tail of the plane, it meant that a lot of tail gunners sustained higher casualties, especially when you think about the fact that a lot of times the tail was a place that was hit, especially by fighters. And so that is why this position and this role carried such a high risk and high responsibility.
However, in 1943, Eugene Moran accepted these risks and fulfilled his duties as the tail gunner well. After arriving in England in October of that year, he joined the crew of B-17 Rikki Tikki Tavi. This photo shown here is the only image I have been able to find with the nose art of Rikki Tikki Tavi. It is a beautiful B-17 with an even more beautiful pinup girl to go along with it. Now, as I tell you the story of Eugene Moran, I also want to introduce you to another B-17 tail gunner. This would be a Kentucky native by the name of James Rayleigh. Unlike Eugene, however, James was stationed in Italy with the 301st Bomb Group. And you might be asking, why do I need to know about another tail gunner on the other side of Europe? And just wait, you won't believe how he ties into this story. But we will come back to that later. For now, let's continue with Gene. Rikki Tikki Tavi would see her first combat in late 1943, participating in more than a dozen raids into German-occupied territory. Her crew can be seen here with their beloved B-17 in between sorties. Gene Moran is second from the right on the back row. Thus far, facing flak and German fighters, these missions had been challenging, but she had always managed to come home. On November 29th of 1943, however, she and her crew would take off for a mission from which they would never return. This final raid was an assignment to strike the German city of Bremen. This was a key target for the 8th Air Force in World War II, as it was an industrial center for many vital parts of the Nazi war machine. On this late November day, just a few days after Thanksgiving, the 96th Bomb Group took to the air and formed up over Europe. Before too long, Germany was beneath them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around them and a few German fighters attacked the flight. But Moran and Rikki Tikki Tavi made it through. Over Bremen, the bombardier gave the call for bombs away, and the American bombers dropped their payload, adding just a few of the 5,000 tons of bombs that would be dropped on Bremen before the war's end. A few minutes later, the formation turned back for England. But as they did this, unbeknownst to them, the enemy was preparing to strike. After the bomber flight had been sighted over Germany, more Luftwaffe fighters had been scrambled to intercept and were now just a few kilometers away. Unfortunately, at this time, for the bombers of the 96th, their fighter escorts were already gone. They were now alone. This meant that the fate of the B-17s would now rest in the ability of their gunners. The 109s dove in and attacked the flying fortresses. Despite the best efforts of the gunners, the Germans would score quite a few victories today. Their machine guns and cannons tore into the American flight. Rikki Tikki Tavi would soon be in the crosshairs of a German fighter and took substantial damage. According to Gene Moran's book that retells this story, multiple crew members on board of Rikki Tikki Tavi were hit. Gene was struck in both of his arms and an explosion broke his ribs. A few seconds later, a bullet also went straight through his parachute. Immediately, he knew that he had to try and bail out of the airplane, but oftentimes, from the tail position, this is easier said than done. As he went to grab his new parachute so that he could exit the bomber, Moran felt a jolt, and the tail section was severed from the rest of the aircraft. He was now spinning, falling through the sky alone from 20,000 feet. The only parachute that he had was filled with bullet holes and was completely unusable. His fate was now inevitable. His speed accelerated so much that the gold fillings in his teeth began to pop out one by one from the intense change in pressure. He later said that during this fall, he was thinking simply and just relaxed. He said to himself, "I'm going to die, so why fight it?" However, Moran was wrong. As the severed tail fell down and met the ground, it struck a tall tree. When it hit this tree, the force of the fall was cushioned, and the tail section was saved from being completely crushed upon impact. When Moran awoke, he realized that he was alive, and that he had cheated death. Here we can see a newspaper article from the following year on this story, featuring an eyewitness testimony from another airman of the 96th Bomb Group who had to bail out as well during the Bremen raid. It reads, "It happened last November 29th, Fisher said, after flak had cut off the plane tail, with Moran, the tail gunner, caught inside. Moran couldn't jump because his parachute had been shot full of holes, so he folded the chute around him and waited for the inevitable. As the tail dropped earthward, the damaged vertical fin and horizontal stabilizers stabbed into a tree and held. Fisher said he saw the plane tail fall and lodge in the tree as he floated to earth after bailing out of a plane which had been hit on a bombing mission over Bremen. After he was captured, Fisher said he heard Germans talking about a soldier found in the tail of a plane, and later heard Moran's story when the two men became friends in the prison camp. Now, if you skip down below in this article, we can see another name mentioned, James Rayleigh. So this is probably the appropriate time to pick back up with his story. A few weeks after this, Rayleigh was on a B-17 as well, named Skippy, flying on a mission to bomb a harbor near Athens, Greece. This was his unlucky 13th mission and would take place on January 11th of 1944. During this mission, a thick cloud cover fell over the 301st Bomb Group as they were nearing their target. Tragically, in the low visibility and subpar communication, another group of B-17s from a different bomb group would collide with Rayleigh's flight, sending 8 flying fortresses plummeting towards the ground. Being in the tail gunner position, Rayleigh had no idea what was happening when he felt a hard collision and started spinning. According to his recollection, all that he knew was that he was spiraling and falling at an alarming speed. However, he did feel that he was not in free fall, but almost floating downward. Because of this, he actually had no idea that the tail section had become detached from the rest of the bomber. Like Moran though, he did think that he was going to die in just a few moments. But miraculously, he too would be wrong. The severed tail section from B-17's Skippy floated down and landed on a tree, where James Rayleigh climbed out and unbelievably walked away from the wreckage. As he retells the story, he even mentions that he found 3 candy bars in the wreckage before climbing out. Now, I know what you are thinking. TJ, you're incredible, locating 2 stories about this insane sort of incident. But I'm about to do even better. This might be the best story of all. Last month, I had a viewer send me an interesting audio file. This is a recording of a World War II veteran who was an engineer with the US infantry in Europe in 1944 and 1945. This veteran has unfortunately since passed away, but thankfully, many of his war stories have been preserved in this recording. About 7 minutes into this retelling of his wartime endeavors, there is one story that I think you have to hear for yourselves, about another American tail gunner on board of a B-24. Let's listen to it now.
Anyhow, that was the afternoon that finally the weather cleared enough that our bombers could take off from England and southern France and come on over the B-24s and the B-17s. And so there was a great big flight of B-24s coming right at us from the west. And right on that, right on their tail was a bunch of German fighter planes. Well, those fighters could outmaneuver the bombers, and so they started firing into them, and they knocked quite a few of them out of the sky, but one of them was right to the west of us as they were coming in from the west, and it just flew all to pieces. Well, we counted the guys that got out of there, and we accounted for everybody but the tail gunner, and we never did see him parachute out. But the tail had broken off at quite an angle, and all it did was float down from one side to the other. And when it hit the ground, this guy happened to have his leg underneath a piece of it, and he got a broken leg out of it, but he was still in there. Getting out of those when you're a tail gunner was really a hard job. So then we went over there. It landed to less than a quarter of a mile from where we were. So we took a Jeep and run over there, and he thought we were one of the Germans dressed up in American uniforms because they had been doing that. And it took us about 45 minutes to prove to him that we were American soldiers, but he was pinned underneath that and had a broken leg. And finally we proved that we were American soldiers, so we lifted that part of the tail off of him, put him in the Jeep, and hauled him to a rest, well, not a rest area, it was actually an area where we took the injured about another quarter mile down the road, and took him in down there. And then the next day I went down to see him, and I tell you, he was just so happy. He said, "Man, I'm sure glad you guys came along, and I feel like a fool now that well, he had his 45 ready to use it on it if we didn't." And he said, "I feel like a fool now that I threatened you." And I said, "Well, that's all right." But I asked him how he's doing. He said, "Well, they've taken the pain away, and I'll be moved out this afternoon yet." So that was one good thing that came out of us being close to where a part of that plane came down.
There you have it, another unbelievable story from a first-hand witness of a tail gunner surviving a fall in the severed section of his bomber. Clearly, based on these three stories, it was possible for tail gunners to potentially survive if they were separated and unable to bail. There was obviously something that allowed them to live in these situations: the aerodynamics of the tail, the weight of the severed section of the plane, or even perhaps the hand of God. All we can do today is simply marvel at these fascinating stories and thank the remaining heroes from the greatest generation. Comment on what story I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.